Okay, I think we'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Robert Dorr, and I'm the Mortgage Fellow in Poverty Studies here at AEI, where I focus on our nation's large safety net programs. One of our objectives in the Poverty Studies program here at AEI is to bring attention to new work and important scholars who can shed light on what is going on in low-income communities and families. We also try to act as a convener of experts in the field who come at this from multiple perspectives. To accomplish those objectives, we have had the pleasure of partnering with the people at the American Academy of Political and Social Science. And in the past, we've hosted convenings on housing and spatial segregation. And today's topic is rural poverty. And I'm very glad that we have three outstanding scholars with us today to discuss this issue, which often in discussions of poverty get overlooked. It is our aim this afternoon to diagnose and assess and contemplate and propose paths forward for the problem of rural poverty. And I'm very pleased to call upon AAPS's Executive Director, Tom Ketchkemethy. Did I get that right, Tom? Close enough. To provide his own introductions and also to introduce more formally our speakers today. And the way it's going to go is Tom will introduce our panelists, our two experts will present, and then Dottie and I will respond. So I'll be back later. Thank you.
Good day, everybody. And thank you, Robert. Thanks so much to AEI. We're a relatively small organization up in Philadelphia, and it always benefits us when we're doing work down here in D.C. to partner with organizations that are like-minded and evidence-heavy. So it's always a pleasure to partner with AEI on events like this. Special thanks to Robert. I'm Tom Ketchkemethy, Executive Director of the APSS and Executive Editor of our journal, The Annals. Dan, would you hold up the Annals right there? There's the Annals. I forgot to bring it up with me. Greetings from the city of brotherly love. APSS exists to advance social science in the public sphere and to make the power of social research and evidence available to public policymakers and to the general public. To do that principally, we publish the Annals, mustering research on areas of particular social concern, and then making that work evident and that evidence evident to public policymakers and thought leaders in meaningful ways. So with that said, I was very pleased 3 years ago to be introduced to Dan Lichter at a conference at Cornell and to learn from him that he thought it was time for social researchers to reconsider their approaches to studying rural and urban connectedness. In time, Dan's ideas for a volume matured, and then we were very lucky and very pleased to bring Jim Ziliak on board as a co-editor of what would eventually become that July volume, The New Rural-Urban Interface, which both defines and describes rural-urban boundaries as they exist in America today, and also presents 13 pieces of new, original, empirical work showing how rural-urban disparities are manifest in population dynamics, health and education, internal migration, and of course, the topic that brings us here today, economics and poverty. Anticipating this event, we asked our publisher, Sage, to make this volume open and free, and they've agreed to do that for a time. So if you go to ann.sagepub.com, you can browse all of the contents to your heart's delight. So this volume published in midsummer, I happened to be sitting next to Robert at a conference, and it was a very quick thing for us to agree to do some sort of an event, and here we are. So welcome again, and I'll turn to substance now with a quick introduction of our presenters. Jim Ziliak is an economist who holds the Gatton Endowed Chair in Microeconomics at the University of Kentucky, where he also directs the university's Center on Poverty Research and the Kentucky Federal Statistical Research Data Center. He's published extensively on poverty, including its rural dimensions, and has been a leader among economists for his analyses of anti-poverty measures at the individual and community levels. He's also written extensively on earnings and income volatility and food insecurity. Notably, vis-a-vis today's session, he chaired an NAS committee investigating childhood hunger, and he's edited books on the war on poverty in Appalachia, another one on the long-term social effects of welfare reform, and still another book that shows how and why the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program is a worthy pillar of the social safety net. On top of it all, he's simply been a delight for us to work with on this Annals project, and more than willing to participate in our efforts and to get this work out there into the public sphere. So, Jim, thanks so much for agreeing to come down and do this session. Dan Lichter, simply put, is a big deal among qualitative or quantitative sociologists. His academic interests are broad, including long-standing interests that include population dynamics of employment, underemployment, poverty, marriage and family studies, and immigration. I counted about 160 articles and book chapters on his resume covering these areas and many, many more. He took a PhD at University of Wisconsin-Madison and has since been on faculty at other flagship public universities, including Penn State, Ohio State, and now Cornell, where he's the Ferris Family Professor in the Department of Policy Analysis and Management, a professor of sociology, and director of Cornell's Institute for the Social Sciences. Perhaps Dan can tell us if his public university pedigree has anything to do with his career-long interest in rural populations and social dynamics. He's a past president of both the American Sociological Association and the Population Association of America, and has been a longtime member and past vice president of the Rural Sociological Society. So once they're done with their presentations, Robert has been good enough to agree to moderate a conversation among them. But before that happens, Dottie Rosenbaum is going to, and I hope I'm saying, is it Baum or Baum? I'm sorry, with my name. So Dottie is going to be giving some brief discussant remarks. Dottie is a former budget analyst at the CBO, who has a long history of doing the sorts of cost projections for social programs that have now been so much and so unfortunately in the news these days. She's now at the CBPP, the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, having joined them in 2000. Her work focuses primarily on federal and state issues and SNAP, that's the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, as well as issues that involve the coordination of SNAP and other state-administered health and income security programs like Medicaid, TANF, and child care. She's also expert on the matters of the federal budget and federal budget process. So there are our speakers. We're going to start with Dan, I believe, and then Jim, and then go to discussion. Thanks so much for being here. It's a pleasure.
Is there a screen here for presentations?
Yeah, push the button forward.
Aha, there we go. So I guess I was supposed to, based on Tom's introduction, I was supposed to say a little bit about my interest in rural. I actually grew up in rural South Dakota in a small town, and one of 11 kids. My father was an electrician and had a farm background. So that's been part of my long-term interest in rural America. Probably a third of what I do is on that particular topic. And one of the things I've always done throughout my entire career is try to figure out how we can mainstream rural-related research, rural-related social science, rather than having our sort of metrocentric, urban-oriented kind of approach to social science, where rural America has been sort of invisible and in the background. And I think, rural America has sort of stepped up in this last election and told us how they feel. So today what I'm going to do is talk about rural poverty a little bit, and I have several particular goals here. One is that I want to remind everybody that some of the initial interest in rural America and in poverty more generally came about 50 years ago. And so I want to say a little bit about that with the war on poverty. I want to say a little bit about measuring rural poverty in an increasingly urban society. So what does it mean when we talk about poverty in rural America? I want to then go into identifying 6 distinctive features of rural poverty. And then I want to finish with some caveats. And I guess one of the caveats I want to make clear here, besides this orientation toward a more spatially inclusive approach, less metrocentric, I want us to also think about what we can do for rural America from a policy standpoint going forward. And especially I want to talk about some of the people left behind in rural America over the last several decades. Okay, what am I doing wrong here? Okay, here we go. Do you think you could maybe, I'm supposed to be able to see that. Thank you. So I think in the public mind, we think of poverty in America as essentially an urban problem, a minority problem. We think about poverty as a big city slum or a inner city neighborhood. When in fact 50 years ago, the war on poverty started in central Appalachian, eastern Kentucky, with rural people. And shortly after 1964, when President Johnson declared the war on poverty, he formed a national advisory committee on rural poverty. And I'm not going to repeat everything that's in this slide here, but essentially talked about how the poverty in America was, rural America was a national disgrace and a group of people that we've forgotten about. And as I'll show you in a bit, some of the things that were done, there was tremendous improvement in rates of poverty in rural America over the 1960s in particular. So I guess the charge today is to talk a little bit about how we should consider rural poverty. And I think where we are today really depends on how we define rural America, rural areas, and so on. I remember a few months ago I gave a talk at the office of the GAO, and they said they were interested in rural America, and they said we'd like you to come in and talk to us because my colleagues think that rural America is the outlying areas of Washington D.C. And I said, maybe that's not the case. And so I think we need to think a little bit about what we mean by rural, and I'll say a little bit about that. But I think it also depends on how we define poverty. And I'm going to talk about some of the measurement issues related to that as well. One of the things that we spent time on in our special issue of the Annals was to focus on the fluidity of rural and urban boundaries. And I have this chart here just to make a basic point and that is, you can see the chart that goes from the first decennial census in 1790 to the most recent census in 2010. And over time, you can see that the share of population that involves metropolitan growth has been primarily responsible for overall U.S. growth. And we're at a point today in American society where about half of all people in the United States reside in suburban areas outside the central city counties of metropolitan areas, the big cities. Maybe 35% are in the big cities, and the rest, the 15% or so, are in non-metropolitan areas, and they are declining. I think the point that I want to make is when we talk about rural and urban America over time, we have to also think that many non-metropolitan and rural areas actually grow up to be metropolitan and urban areas. People become urban from their rural backgrounds by virtue of growth. So every decennial census, populations get redefined from non-metropolitan to metropolitan, leaving behind, in a sense, those non-metropolitan counties that probably have the lowest prospects for growth and economic development. So I think it's important to think about what we mean then when we talk about these shifting boundaries. And of course, this was a major part of our Annals volume, and where we talk about the shifting of boundaries and what it means for rural and urban America and how we measure economic hardship and material well-being. I think what's different, though, about the most recent period is that for the first time, however, despite this redefinition or this reclassification of non-metropolitan to metropolitan counties, we've seen an absolute decline in rural population. In the past, rural areas, by virtue of an excess of fertility over mortality, natural increase, was able to overcome the chronic outmigration from rural to urban areas, which we all are familiar with. And for the first time ever, that was no longer the case in the first 5 or 6 years of the 2010 plus period. So we have an absolute population decline, and in many cases this has been going on for a long time. We probably have somewhere in the order of 1,300 counties now that have experienced natural decrease, where deaths exceed births. And some of this has been going on for a long time, especially in the heartland of America, middle America, where there's been a real hollowing out of population. And in fact, in many places in the central part of the United States, they reached their peak population size 50 or 60 years ago, back in the 30s and 40s, when the size of farm populations were much bigger, where people depended on rural small towns for employment and for commercial activities. And since then, with the consolidation of agricultural production and land holdings, we've seen a much smaller share of the population that is living in these rural areas. And for the first time ever, as I said, in the most recent 5 or 6 year period, we've experienced absolute population decline, not only by chronic outmigration from rural areas, which has been going on for a long time, but the outmigration, or the excess of deaths over births, primarily because we've lost people of reproductive age, and we've got a very old elderly population in many parts of rural America. So the second part of this, so the definition is key, I think, when we start thinking about what we mean by rural. We're talking about a declining share of the population that reflects both decline, but it also reflects this reclassification, places that grow up to be essentially demographic winners. But the other part of this is how we measure poverty. And if you look at this particular graph, you'll see that over time there was convergence between metropolitan and non-metropolitan rates of poverty, and they've paralleled each other essentially over the last 40 or 50 years. After quite large differences back in the 60s when we first started worrying about poverty and measuring it appropriately. I do want to say, however, that when we look at poverty rates that change or that take into account the cost of living, that take into account family size, that take into account in-kind benefits, you can see that this excess or this higher rate of poverty in rural areas, in fact, is not replicated when we look at the supplemental measure, this new poverty measure that takes into account those things that the Census Bureau has developed over the last 10 years or so based on a National Academy report back in the late 1990s. And I want to come back to this because I think it's important, even when you look at these data, that there are tremendous heterogeneity in what you find in rural America when you start looking at different population groups. A lot of this difference, this reversal, reflects the fact that rural elderly people benefit most from the fact the elderly in an aging population of rural people have benefited from Medicare, Social Security, and so on, which I think has played a very big role in these declining rural areas that are aging very rapidly. You can see here the same sort of approach. This has happened over a long period of time, and when you look at these rates here, you can see on the left-hand side the disparity using the conventional official measure of poverty on the right, and you can see basically the changeover from what occurred 40, 50 years ago and what it is today, where it's actually lower. So the declines have been steeper in rural areas over the recent past. I remember growing up in South Dakota back in the 1950s and 60s. We'd visit relatives on the farm. They were still in a period where there was not rural electrification or rural running water, rural transportation. It was very difficult to get from one place to another. And I'm going to come back to that issue as well. The third basic issue I wanted to talk about, what I regard based on the literature and what I've seen with the empirical evidence, are the 6 key dimensions of rural poverty. In many cases, these key dimensions, I think, that distinguish it from urban poverty are quite not only important, but I think they're also changing rapidly over the last 20 or 30 years. And I'll start by just saying the first issue is that unlike urban areas where we think about concentrated neighborhood poverty, where you've got very high rates of growth, I think when you think about rural areas, you have to think about regional concentration of poverty. And here we're talking about the concentration of poverty primarily in places like Appalachia, especially central Appalachia. We're talking about the Mississippi Delta and the so-called Black Belt Crescent, which goes from Arkansas to the Piedmont area of North Carolina that sort of mimics the old slave and plantation South. You can think of the borderlands. And in my part of the country where I grew up in South Dakota, where you had Indian reservations, where poverty rates there are extremely high, oftentimes over 50% on Indian reservations. So I want to mention, when you look at this concentrated poverty, you can think about the heartland, you can think about the Farm Belt and poverty there, or you can think about Appalachian, but some of the most invisible and forgotten places in America, rural areas, are areas that are heavily concentrated with minority populations. And this chart is from a colleague that provided me, Leif Jensen at Penn State University, who's done a lot of work on rural areas. This is our rates of deep poverty. And you can see on the very left-hand side the very high rates of deep poverty. We're talking about 50% of the official poverty measure. Far exceeds the level of black poverty in cities overall, but also in central cities. And again, we think of big city, central city, inner city populations, especially of minorities, as poverty populations that are large and deeply impoverished. And we can see here that some of the most impoverished areas are these rural minority counties. I also, a second dimension here I think that's important to consider is the persistence of poverty. Jim Ziliak in a moment will talk a little bit about this with respect to Appalachia, and we can see these are the Economic Research Services persistent poor counties. You can see they basically mimic what we saw for concentrated poverty. These are areas that have been poor for a long time. So we can talk about the declines in rural poverty over the last 20 or 30 years, especially in the 1960s. But you can see in many places these counties, these regional pockets of poverty, continue to have very high and intractable rates of poverty. And that comes through here. And again, these are not only Appalachia, but they are also areas that are heavily concentrated with minority populations that most of us don't necessarily go to visit. I also want to say that persistence too, although we still don't have very good research on this, is you can also think about persistence in terms of how long, if people are poor, they stay poor. Do they stay in poor for a long time? Are they chronically poor, or do they are poor for a short period of time and then exit out, they find a job, get married, whatever, get access to welfare, or so on. And I think one of the studies, and the last study that I've seen about this is maybe 15 or 20 years ago, that showed the chronic nature of rural poverty, how long people are poor, how long children are poor when they fall into poverty, seems to be much higher than what we see in urban areas. We also, it's important here, I think, also to look at the upward mobility. There's a lot of interest based on the work of Raj Chetty. We also have a chapter in our annuals issue about the patterns, the geographic patterns of upward socioeconomic mobility. To what extent do people exceed the socioeconomic status of their parents? And some of the places that have done best are places in the agricultural heartland. Places that have done the worst tend to be in the rural South, especially among African Americans or Hispanics. They also tend to be very low in Appalachia as well. So that also contributes to this spatial concentration and persistence of poverty there. So I think that's another important thing to think about. Historically, the nature of poverty has been tied less to work in rural areas perhaps than in urban areas, where there was much more dependence on welfare income. But that's changed over the recent past. It's always been the case that rates of work among the poor were much higher in rural areas than they were in urban areas. And that also the extent of working poverty was greater in rural areas than in urban areas. And that's changed a good deal over the last 20 years. And I'll show you one chart right here that just illustrates this. You can see here, this is hard to see with the color scheme. This is some work that my colleague Brian Thede and I had done a couple years ago. But the point here is whether you define poverty by 60% of the average income or by the poverty threshold itself, you can see that 20, 30 years ago, the poor were more likely to work in rural areas than in urban areas. And you can see by the most recent period in which these data were collected, that's no longer the case, that rural people are less likely to work than are urban people. And in each case, whether we're talking about urban or rural areas, you can see the decline in the shares of people, all people that are working. Now, again, there's great heterogeneity in this. We know from evidence on the welfare targeted population. We look at poor single mothers, for example. We know that we've seen increasing rates of poverty of work among working mothers who increasingly work. So again, we have to look at the great diversity of experience across many of these areas. I should say here, there's an old saying in the rural social sciences that when you've seen one rural community, you've seen one rural community. Every community is very much different from the others, and I think it's important to distinguish a rural part of South Dakota from Vail, Colorado, or the Keys, or some area within close driving distance of DC that might even act still as a commuting area for the Washington or New York suburbs. A fourth distinctive change historically has been regarding family change. And here I think it's important because historically we've thought of rural America as being a kind of safe haven, holding traditional family values, strong families, strong kinship networks, and so on. But the fastest changes in America with respect to the family is really in rural areas. There's been substantial increases over time in the shares of non-marital births in rural areas, increase in cohabitation to the point where more rural children live as a share of the population, more rural children live with a cohabiting couple, with cohabiting parents than is the case with metropolitan areas. We also see increasing female-headed families. This is important for kids and for those families because they have disproportionately large or high rates of poverty. So I think the key here really is the indicators which suggest that there's rapid convergence over time in these key family indicators, and the fact that they're converging suggests that the increase has been much more rapid in rural areas than in urban areas. I don't need to go into this a lot. This just shows you the change over time in the shares of kids who are living in counties distinguished by the well-being of their parents. You can see in each case from the early period, the orange there, to the later period, the green, this upward tick in shares of kids who are living in female-headed families or single-parent families. But you can also see in the poorest areas, which is the far right two histograms, are the highest. So still, we see the differential, but we also see the large increases over time. I will say here, too, that there's been a lot of interest in trying to understand the sources of these increases. This goes into cultural changes, the urbanization of rural space. It has to do with the access to family planning, preventive services and family planning programs and so on. A number of different things that people are working on today that try to understand what's happening with respect to the rise in female-headed households and the children that live in there who tend to be poor. A third thing I think it's important to keep track is to look at the immigrant population in the United States. We've seen this case where immigrants were primarily in the United States located in the Southwest or in big cities. And since probably 1990 or so, we've seen a tremendous dispersal of rural people out into rural areas and into places that previously had no exposure to minority populations, much less immigrant populations. And in many rural areas, you can see that a lot of the growth, if I can get this right, you can see that a lot of the growth is occurring only as a result of immigrant growth, especially of Hispanics. About 60% of all the growth in rural areas, in these non-metropolitan areas over the 2000 to 2010 period was due to the growth of the Hispanic population. In many cases, these Hispanic populations are very much concentrated in what I like to think of as Hispanic boom towns. In fact, about 10% of the growth of Hispanics accounted for about 50% of the growth in these non-metropolitan areas. So tremendous increase, and of course this is the population historically that's had disproportionately high rates of poverty. I've been doing some work recently on the new growth or the new increases in poverty in rural areas, and a big component of this is among Hispanic children. We have high rates of fertility among Hispanics. These are children that are born in the United States. I've been looking at newborn Hispanic babies, and if you look at rural and urban areas, you see the distinctive differences, but when you look at these new destinations, areas that previously hadn't had Hispanic populations, much less immigrants, you saw that the poverty rates for them were upwards of 50% of these newborns. And when we think about going forward, those children enter and diversify schools first. Diversity occurs from the bottom up, and it raises all kinds of questions about intergenerational upward mobility and how these kids will be integrated into American society and take on productive adult roles. The last thing I want to say very briefly is the welfare safety net. Historically in the United States, rural people, rural families have been less dependent on welfare income, a kind of stigmatization. Even among those who are eligible for welfare are less likely to use it, food stamps, cash assistance programs, and so on. But they also have less access to public housing, those sorts of things as well. I just want to follow up with the information that I provided earlier on these poor newborn children. You can see here essentially mimics what I just said. That is, these poor children are less likely to be in homes. Only about 10% receive any kind of cash assistance, about half receive food stamps, and in non-metropolitan areas these rates are lower than what we see. And again, these are kids who are not only poor but are very poor. We're talking about kids who have poverty rates on average that are about 50% of the poverty threshold. This just follows up on the earlier thing. This shows what the poverty rates look like in the official rate. And then after, when we talk about before and after tax and transfers, on the left you can see the difference. On the right you can see very little change in poverty rates officially for metropolitan areas and slower declines. In rural areas, much more dependent on tax and transfers than what we see in urban areas. And again, as I said, part of this, or a big part of this, has to do with the elderly, but it also, if you look at this by children or the adult working population, you see the same sort of thing, but to a lesser an extent. So let me give you some quick takeaway messages. I think one thing that I want to emphasize is that aggregates may increasingly mask substantial heterogeneity, not only in the different populations that experience hardship, but we also see this across America's regions, across states and across different kinds of communities. I think we need a much better effort to understand poverty in rural areas, because it's not just, this question comes up about cost of living, but you also, when you look at poor people in rural areas, they also have less access to the things that go along with being an American. That is, access to public health, access to good public schools, public transportation, childcare, all these things that are part and parcel to growing up in a healthy way and taking on productive adult roles. And then lastly, I think that we need to think about these boundaries and how we cross boundaries. And we still, in the United States, and we haven't talked very much about this, but it's discussed in our volume, we still have substantial patterns of outmigration of the best and brightest, sort of the brain drain from rural areas, which reinforces the inequality. It reinforces the growth that's occurring in metropolitan areas, sometimes at the expense of these rural areas, which languish behind without the kinds of things that might be required for these kids to do well as adults. So let me just say, I think the last election, the Trump era, I think has certainly put rural America on the forefront. I think it's raised all kinds of questions. I hope I've whetted your appetite a little bit. I think it also raises questions about the role that choice versus constraints play in these kinds of patterns. Are rural people, for example, who remain in Appalachia, are they deciding to vote or not vote with their feet? And it also raises questions about whether we want to introduce some kind of place-based policy, such as what Obama had done or tried to do with sort of regional development strategies, or whether we need to think about more programs that target individuals, including things that might target people to move to opportunity and provide ways for people to find jobs elsewhere. So thank you all very much.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Jim Ziliak. I'm a professor of economics at the University of Kentucky. And I want to thank Robert for organizing this event today, and to Tom and Dan for inviting me to be a part of the special issue of the Annals. So it's been a delight to be a partner with Dan over the last year and a half, and Tom as well. So Dan's conclusion was a good setup for what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this issue of persistent poverty in America and the regions of persistent poverty. And I'm going to highlight some research that I've conducted over the last 5 to 7 years. So the title of my talk is Missing Markets and Persistent Poverty in Rural America. And the market that's missing in rural America is the demand for and the supply of high-skilled labor, where the primary growth in the United States has occurred over the last 2 decades. And so that's kind of the end point of my presentation. So give you a brief overview. I'll talk about the emergence of these persistently poor regions. Dan talked about that a little bit already, and I'll give you a little bit more background on the emergence of that. I'll talk about the factors that set these persistently poor regions apart from other parts of America. I will return to this issue as is there a potential role for place-based policy? And I'll zoom in on the area of Appalachia to talk about that, in particular the Appalachian Regional Development Act. So a distinction between a northerner and a southerner is I live in the south and I say Appalachia. He lives in the north and he calls it Appalachia. And there is kind of a north-south divide on the language there. So it's the same place though. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just kind of run you through some county poverty rates, beginning with the 1960 decennial census. And so the dark blue is poverty rates, the deepest blue is county poverty rates in excess of 50%. So that means more than 1 in 2 households was living in poverty in these counties. And you can see in the south of the United States that deep blue was very prevalent. And so this is kind of the map that President Kennedy saw when he was running for office in 1960, and he traveled to the state of West Virginia, which had at that time a average county poverty rate of about 58%. And he pledged to address the issue of poverty if he were to be elected. And so you can see that, from this very dark blue in 1960, that within a decade, there was substantial decline in poverty in the United States in that ensuing 10 years. However, what you see is this emergence of these persistently poor areas that the one graph that Dan showed earlier highlighted. And so if you look at 1969, so 10 years later, there's a lot less of that deep blue in the south, okay? And if you kind of focus your eye on, say, the Atlanta, Georgia, or Charlotte, North Carolina area, these are areas of the country that really, these urban areas that really took off in the 1960s. And they kind of had that spillover effect in the metropolitan reaches and even beyond the direct metro area of those large cities. But if you look at kind of the Mississippi Delta region, the eastern Kentucky and the central Appalachian region, the Black Belt region that Dan talked about from North Carolina down to Arkansas and Alabama, and then the counties along the Rio Grande, as well as the Native American reservations, you can see that this deep blue persists even at 1969. That's the 1970 census. Fast forward another decade, a lot less blue on the map, okay? And now we're moving more towards red, and red is county poverty rates between 0 and 10%. Okay, now this is using the official poverty measure. In 1960, most of the programs in the social safety net weren't in existence yet. So the only programs that would have been picked up in 1960 would have been the aid to families with dependent children, which is now TANF. It would have been Social Security, retirement, and disability insurance. And that's about it, right? So food stamps, Medicaid, Medicare came later, okay? Another decade beyond, so things actually improved for a while in the mid-'80s, and then as we approached the recession of 90-91, basically if you look at 79 to 89, there was a little bit fallback actually in rural America. But then if you jump to 1999, you can see a tremendous amount of red, okay, through this part. But throughout, these decennial censuses, you can see kind of that persistence of the blue in those regions, okay? And so the next map then is a version of what Dan showed, not as pretty with my colors here, but this is from the 1960 to 2000 census. And so the deep blue regions are actually, this is the same graph that Dan showed, and they're the same. There's been no change even if you update it with the American Community Survey to more recent years. These persistently poor counties are the same. It's about 11% of all counties in America are classified as persistently poor. So there's over 3,000 counties in the US, so it's a little over 300 counties that fall into this persistently poor category. So what are some, so in one project, we want to ask the following question. Are persistently poor counties poor because they have lower levels of productive factors? Okay, lower levels of human capital or education, lower levels of physical capital. Okay, it's kind of a classic question, more often addressed by macroeconomists in trying to explain growth across countries, right? Well, there's no reason why we can't do this in this great country of ours, right? We've got 50 experiments, right, with different states, okay? So, and then over 3,000 counties. So we can conduct very much this similar type of exercise within our own borders. Or do they use these factors of production less efficiently, okay? Is there something about the production technology and kind of the non-poor areas that kind of combines labor and capital together to be more efficient in the production process? Or do they actually have lower levels of initial productivity? And so some of the areas that macroeconomists have also looked at is some of the historical factors that help determine development. For example, there could be historic differences in culture. There could be, and that could include religiosity, for example. Okay? The famous sociologist Max Weber, right, focused on the Protestant work ethic, for example, right? It's kind of a classic question in development. Does geography matter? Okay, does the actual ability to combine labor and capital together matter? Do institutions matter? These are all kind of classic questions in the growth literature. And my colleagues at the University of Kentucky and I addressed this in a 2015 paper titled "On Persistent Poverty in a Rich Country." So, first of all, persistently poor counties are characterized by a lot of common factors. Okay, what's interesting about these 5 regions in the US, where they differ is primarily on race and ethnicity. Okay, so Appalachia is primarily white. The Black Belt and Delta region are primarily African American. The counties on the Rio Grande are primarily Hispanic. And then the Native American reservations are Native Americans. And so they differ on race and ethnicity, but they share a lot more in common than the difference is by race. So they share in common that there's education attainment is a lot lower. So I highlight high school graduates because we didn't collect in decennial censuses college completion until after the 1970 census. So in 2000, there was a 15 percentage point gap in high school completion amongst adults 25 and older in these persistently poor areas. There was a historic deficit. So in our project, what we do is we primarily use decennial census data from 60 to 2000, but we actually go back to the start of the 20th century and actually the end of the 19th. So we use some census data at the county level from 1890 and 1900. And at that time, education was measured by literacy at the county level. Could you read or write? Okay, so the persistently poor counties today in America, a century ago, had rates of illiteracy 3.5 times, okay, in 1900, 3.5 times greater than the non-poor areas today. Okay, so one way to think about what I'm talking about is the long reach of human capital. Education sticks, okay, and so this becomes kind of a key part of our story. Fewer people are in the labor force, Dan talked about this, and there's slower growth in the labor force. So for example, in the 2000 census, the participation rate was 10 percentage points lower, and that's actually expanded today, okay, relative to these non-poor areas, and grew much slower. There was lower capital spending, okay, so capital spending in these poor areas about 1/10 of what it is in the non-poor, okay, so there's a lot fewer capital dollars going to these poor regions. And there's, well, by definition, lower rates of urbanization, okay? And this is going to turn out to be a very important part of the story over the last 20 to 30 years, okay, and understanding the development, the evolution of wages and incomes in the United States. So what we find in that paper is that the combined contribution of historical and contemporary human capital is very large. It accounts for about almost 2/3 of the income gap between persistently poor and non-poor regions in the United States. And what's fascinating is about 25 percentage points of that 60% is actually accounted for by that initial deficit a century ago in human capital. Okay, so that's the idea that human capital sticks. And so closing that human capital gap is going to be very important going forward. Urbanicity also matters. And urbanicity can actually explain about 15% of the gap between, and so, we're explaining around 75% of the gap between persistently poor and non-poor regions just by human capital differences and whether or not there's a major urban area within nearby. So some of the policy implications are, how do we resolve some of these human capital shortfalls in these persistently poor regions? Well, there's some very important evidence suggesting that intervening early and often is important. Okay, so early childhood programs to get these children a head start early on, okay, in life and get access to education at a young age. Focusing on school quality, there are some historic gaps in the quality of schools in more of these persistently poor regions, right? Still in America today, most K through 12 schools are funded by local property taxes. And if you don't have much of a local property tax base, and that means the resources going to K through 12 are going to be lacking compared to more well-off counties in America. And then access to higher education. Here, I think this is largely an information problem. So there's been some very fascinating work by Caroline Hawksby and co-authors looking at information flows to low-income children and whether or not they really understand that they have access, right? That there are a lot of programs available to them to access higher education. And today it seems as though information flow is one of the greatest barriers, okay, for many of these kids. They just don't know, right, that they have access to higher ed. The urbanicity issue is more challenging, okay? And so the next part of my presentation, I'm going to focus a little bit more on this. And so this, it's a lot harder to just build a city in rural America, right? So what policymakers oftentimes do then is target particular programs. And so what will ultimately lead us to is talking about our experience with the Appalachian Regional Development Act, which was one of the largest kind of place-based policies that this country has adopted. Okay, so the focus on Appalachia, this is work that with my colleagues Chris Bollinger and Ken Trotsky, some work published back in 2011, and as well as a book that was referenced earlier. It was published at Brookings, a neighbor 2 doors down, titled Appalachian Legacy, Economic Opportunity After the War on Poverty. Okay. So why Appalachia? Well, it turns out Appalachia had a very strong lobbying group 50 years or so ago. The governors of the area got together, okay? And they realized that if they put their heads together along with their congressional delegations, that maybe something might happen. And so after he was elected president, President Kennedy established the president's Regional Appalachian Commission, okay? And so that commission issued the report in 1963, so just 4 years before the People Left Behind report was issued. But here, the focus is strictly on Appalachia, and they describe Appalachia as a region set apart, both geographically and statistically. Geographically, because many of the areas are very hard to reach, especially at that time. Okay, there was very little road transportation to many of the communities, very, very weak infrastructure. And so whether or not the average Appalachian lived in a metropolis, in a town, or on the farm, or in a mountain cabin, has not matched his counterpart in the rest of the U.S. in the nation's economic growth. Okay, so that's where we stood in 1960 at kind of the dawn of the war on poverty. So what we're going to focus on here is the Appalachian region in our research. And so I highlight the Appalachian counties. Today there's about 420 counties that are officially included in the Appalachian Regional Commission's definition. And they're delineated by the northern, okay, the central, and the southern part. Right? And it turns out that their experiences over the last 50 years have been very different, okay, especially over the last 30 years. Okay, so in the work with Bollinger and Kentrosky, what we do is we examine why the wage differentials between men in Appalachia versus the rest of the country and women in Appalachia versus the rest of the country expanded between 1980 and 2000. So we're going to rely on decennial census data. And in particular, what we're trying to do is understand whether or not this expanding wage gap was due to a widening skill deficit in Appalachia compared to the rest of the country, or a widening difference in the returns to those skills, okay? The payoff to higher ed, for example. Does that change over time? So our decompositions actually show that the regional gap in 1980 for men and women was largely due to skill deficits, okay? But as we, use in the title of our paper, Appalachians kind of came down from the mountain, as it were, and increased education. But it turns out they increased education to high school completion. And so there still remains a very large gap between Appalachia and the rest of the country in college completion rates. And that's going to penalize them going forward to the current period today. By 2000, because of that shortfall in higher education attainment, most of the gap is explained actually due to differences in the returns to those skills. Okay? So we actually conclude that Appalachia seems to suffer from a missing market, as I mentioned at the introduction. And it's a shortage of skilled workers as well as a lower premium to that skill. So it seems both a supply and demand problem in the Appalachian region. Okay? And it's also interesting, so we also do a number of things looking at other parts of rural America. And it turns out that the problem isn't so much that Appalachia is rural, right? And that a lot of these gaps have occurred in the rest of rural America, not just the Appalachian region. It's really, since 1980, the problem is that Appalachia lacks a large urban area. The largest urban communities are Birmingham, Alabama, Knoxville, Tennessee, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. All right, those are the largest urban communities, kind of within a couple hours drive of the Appalachian region. So this gives you a sense of kind of that college completion shortfall, the salmon color, right, as the U.S. as a whole. This is the fraction of Americans with a college degree age of Americans 25 and older. So by 2000, it was 25%. Today, that number is about 30%. Okay, so in the 17 years since the 2000 census, we're closer to 30% of Americans 25 and older with a 4-year degree. But the line with each of the three panels, the line on the far left is Appalachian Kentucky, and there, you can see even by 1999 in the Appalachian Kentucky region, only 10% of the population had a college degree. Okay, at that point in time. So that's kind of that skill shortfall. And there's some heterogeneity within the Appalachian region, and that actually is going to matter, right? Some of the regions parts of Appalachia are doing better than others in recent years. And this graph, this one's a little bit more difficult to describe, but what those percentages refer to is your percentage wage gain over a high school dropout. Okay, so this is by year. And on the left panel, we're showing, this is for men in Appalachia, and this is for men with 10 to 20 years of labor market experience, okay? And so in 1980, what you would read this is that the typical high school graduate in 1980 in Appalachia would earn 25% relative to the high school dropout. But notice that line falls over time, okay? The high school graduate's only earning about 19% relative to the dropout by 2000. Okay, it's kind of going in the wrong direction, right? You can see that in the Appalachian part that the return to master's degrees and higher, which is the top line in red, did increase over time. But you can see on the right panel, right, of the screen, that rate of growth increased substantially faster in the rest of the country, okay, outside of Appalachia. And this is especially true for the 4-year degree as well as the master's degree and better, okay? So this is telling us that the returns to skill are rising faster outside of Appalachia than inside Appalachia. And we see the same pattern for women as well, okay? All right, so let me wrap up then with the brief discussion on the Appalachian Regional Development Act. So Dan already mentioned this. We did not necessarily coordinate our pictures of Lyndon Johnson. So this is basically the same trip, different angle, okay? And so he signed the Appalachian Regional Development Act in March of 1965. This is the first major regional economic program since the Tennessee Valley Authority, and is the largest one, since that time. So the act established the Appalachian Regional Commission, and it established their mission to enhance education and job opportunities for individuals residing in the region. It actually also, the Appalachian Commission actually is the group that's designated to define what is the Appalachian region as well, okay, the boundaries. By 2009, about $23.5 billion had been spent. And roughly about half of that was in federal funds, the other half in state. Okay, so it's a federal-state partnership. Right? It turns out that about half of the monies were spent on roads, primarily, so transportation, and the other half on human services, so health clinics, education, that type of stuff. Right? So what are some of the effects on poverty? Kind of the bottom line. So in that book, it's an edited volume. So there are chapters by Janet Curry on health deficits in Appalachia versus the rest of the country, a chapter on Matt Kahn at UCLA on place-based policies. So it's an edited volume. So I wrote a chapter on the effect of the act on poverty. And, I might, well, let me delay what I might say. Let me just tell you what I find, right? So what I do is I look at, what was the effect of the establishment of this region, right, on poverty in the region, okay, relative to the rest of rural America, relative to adjacent counties, and then relative to kind of a wider boundary, okay, kind of the adjacent counties as well as the spillover counties nearby, right? Did the act actually improve poverty? And I also look at income growth in the region relative to the surrounding areas. And what I found is that the act actually did reduce Appalachian poverty between 1960 and 2000 by about 4 percentage points. This is about 10% of the baseline rate, okay? And about 3/4 of that effect actually occurred in the first half decade, basically, okay? And why did that happen? Because the biggest influx of funds occurred into the Appalachian region in that first 5 years after passage, right? And so that the remaining monies have kind of slowed down, in the ensuing decades. The real income per capita grew about 4% faster, okay, within those areas. The effects were largely concentrated in the central and southern regions of Appalachia, okay, and both on poverty as well as income growth. It turns out that the southern Appalachian region has really done well relative to the rest of Appalachia overall. And in fact, in terms of income position, the northern Appalachian region is worse off today compared to the southern region. Okay, and this is largely an artifact of the old kind of industrial belt in the part of Pennsylvania. So let me conclude. Should more be done? And here, this is, the issue. Economists are generally wary, regardless of political persuasion, of place-based policies, because they generally feel as though, policymakers can't choose winners and losers very effectively, okay? So when I was writing this book, I was visiting Brookings, and the late Charles Schultz was still there on staff, and Charlie was the director of President Johnson's budget. And therefore, the Appalachian Development Act went through his desk, and he opposed it, okay? And as you know, Charlie was a Democrat. He opposed the Appalachian Development Act because he didn't think it was a good idea to do a place-based policy, that it was kind of, too not well defined enough, okay? It's better to actually invest in people. So it becomes this challenge. Should we invest in people or in places, right? It's not that easy of a trade-off, but oftentimes it boils down to that. So actually what Charlie was able to do in the legislation is that they changed the wording of the legislation. The original legislation had the money primarily going to the most rural parts of Appalachia. They changed it to the areas that were more urban. because he felt as though it would have a bigger bang for buck in the urban areas of the Appalachian region. Okay. So in 1990, Ralph Widner wrote the 25th anniversary piece on the Appalachian Regional Commission. And his conclusion was that yet in the years ahead, the quality of labor will be the most powerful determinant of local economic development. And in this respect, Appalachia shares a major problem with America's inner cities and other distressed parts of non-metropolitan America, and that's its education gap. And so I think that, more needs to be done. And the emphasis should be on people, policies, and poor places, okay? Primarily on access to education, health and human capital services, right? To endow people with the skills and the ability to either choose to remain where they're at, right? And develop in their local community or move on to other pastures, okay? And I'm gonna stop there because I think I'm done. Thank you.
So, as everyone gets assembled, first of all, I want to say I think we've already had a great discussion, and I'm really very thankful to Tom for motivating this, and to Jim and Dan for being here. These are outstanding scholars, and it's an honor to have them here at AEI. What I want to do now is give Donnie an opportunity to make some observations about what she's heard and this work that we've talked about, and then I'm going to make a few, and then we'll see. You guys can then see how you respond to what we've said, and we can have a little dialogue, and we'll go from there. So Donnie, you're first.
I get to go first. Great.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for including me and inviting me to be here today. I guess I should start by saying I'm really more of a student of this kind of research than I am an expert on it. And so I focus on SNAP, which is formerly the food stamp program. And I can say from personal experience that yes, some of these things are not well understood by policymakers, the importance of and differences with rural areas compared to urban areas. Even though it's a program that largely came out of the war on poverty and the hunger in America, the things that policymakers saw in some of the most currently now still persistently poor areas. So I really feel like I've learned a lot, and as with most things when you're a student, the first thing you learn is how much more you have to learn. So I humbly present these discussant comments, but I'm interested in hearing people's reactions. I would say I first strongly agree with one of the slides that was early in Dan's presentation that pointed out how important the definitions are. How you define rural, how you define poor, matter a lot when you're trying to explain what the poverty rates are in different areas, when you try to draw conclusions about the labor market and about urban versus rural versus non-metro versus suburban versus, all these different words. And it's true at a point in time, and it's true over time. And so in trying to wrap my head around this, I realized at some point, I think late last week as I was learning, that the county-based metropolitan definition that many researchers often use when they say metropolitan and non-metropolitan, which like I said, is based on counties, includes a lot of people who under the census definition, which builds up from census tracts, are actually counted as living in rural areas. And how you draw these boundaries and where you define and put people and how you think of it makes a big difference and makes it, actually, I read the introduction to the book that Jim and Dan wrote that you all published, and it has this sentence which was what sort of crystallized it for me. The majority of all rural people, 54%, as officially defined by the US Census Bureau, now reside in America's metropolitan areas. And I read it 3 or 4 times and said, okay, so then it's really gonna matter how you think about those people. And they talk about the blurring of these distinctions and the importance of, sort of understanding the interdependence. And it just seems like a big challenge for researchers to sort of reconcile our mental structures and our values about rural America and what we think of. I personally think it's where soybeans grow. That's sort of, if soybeans grow there, it must be a rural place. But to sort of reconcile our values and our, like I said, our mental structures of what rural means with a research strategy that's going to actually look at what matters and how do you distinguish descriptively and causally what's important to understand moving forward. So for me, this, in thinking about what intelligent or slightly intelligent things to say today, reinforced two things. The first is that the national benefit programs that have relatively uniform standards that can respond automatically to need where it exists, like SNAP and the Earned Income Tax Credit and Social Security and Medicaid and school meals, are really very important in all parts of the country, but especially in some of the rural and persistently poor parts of the country in terms of evening out some of the long-term disparities in wages, in labor markets, and in state policies and benefit programs. And also in being flexible to the economic conditions in the short term and the long term. And so they make a big difference in terms of easing hardship, and as research is increasingly showing, they provide an important floor and a launching pad for people in terms of their long-term well-being. And the other point I wanted to make about this is that there are still important gaps everywhere, but some of them are more acute in some of the rural areas. For example, in community resources that are available, in economic opportunity, the consequences of isolation, access to technology, transportation, access to healthcare, and education and job training and daycare and all these things that have been talked about. And I found the slides about deep poverty that were included in these presentations especially troubling, and the differences between and among racial groups was also just very eye-opening and troubling. And so I just, this brings me to my third point, which is that from a policy perspective, it makes good sense to think about strategies that address both individual circumstances, individuals' barriers, and as economists say, building human capital, and human, and the whole idea of place-based strategies also, or poor people in poor places. And I think the emerging research on the importance of different places in economic mobility is really fascinating and interesting. But today, the Senate is debating a budget resolution and will likely pass tonight or tomorrow a budget resolution that calls for tax cuts that would benefit the richest among us, paired with deep cuts in programs that help low-income families and individuals across the budget over time. And such an approach would not give us the choice of choosing between place-based or individual strategies. To me, it seems clear that both are probably needed, but such an approach would not allow for any progress in these areas. In fact, it would instead risk taking us back to some of the poverty levels that we saw previously in this country, I think, and undoing a lot of the progress that we've made. And then in addition to the deep cuts that are being put on the table, there are calls for specific cuts in programs so that resources can be redeployed to give more local control to meet people's needs individually with what they need, which again is a very risky strategy. There's certainly a need for additional resources, and they should be targeted to be the most effective and efficient and in ways that are based on the evidence. But we have programs in place that have proven track records of effectiveness and that should not be weakened as part of this process. And finally, I just have to say from a SNAP or food stamp perspective, I can't look at those maps that show the persistently poor counties without, from a SNAP perspective, seeing that in many of those areas, even though unemployment is high and jobs are scarce, people who are unemployed, who are working age, and who don't have children in their homes can only get help with their groceries through the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program for 3 months out of 3 years in many of those places right now. In the past, most of these states had waivers from that time limit because they're high unemployment areas with limited economic opportunity. But most do not now, and or won't soon in the future. And so this is increasing hardship for people in those places, taking resources out of their economies and further straining the charitable networks that do exist in those areas. So I thank you again for your opportunity to be part of this discussion.
Thank you, Dottie. I greatly appreciate your comments. So I have a couple observations about what I learned and what I've seen over the last couple of weeks as I've looked at this. But the first thing I want to say is before I was the commissioner in New York City of social services, I was the commissioner in New York State. And I'm happy to say, Jim, if you looked at the map carefully, there's a teeny bit of little Appalachia in, if I said it correctly, in New York State, Broome County, Tioga County. I had, and I was, frankly, when I was made commissioner, I didn't know that until someone pointed out to me. And so I have a little bit of experience, although I have to say New York State's southern tier counties are not the same as some of the other counties further south in the country. The couple observations I have, first are, I do think it's important, I'd like to really get more deeply into the differences between the supplemental poverty measure and the regular poverty measure, rural versus urban. Because two things are going on there, right? One is sometimes people who benefit from programs are combining work with those programs. The earned income tax credit, sometimes food stamp benefits, other forms of assistance that are not counted in the regular poverty measure are counted in the supplemental poverty measure. And I'd like to know more about whether this is this difference. And it was, in other words, it was lower poverty when the supplemental measure was used than when the official measure is used. Is that more due to work or more due to the benefit take-up rates? And you know, you pointed out, Dan, that there are sometimes different values and cultures at play here with regard to attitudes towards work. And then there's also the cost of living issue. So I think that what we got there in those charts is a beginning of a discussion and a start, but there's a lot more there. The other thing is that Bruce Meyer, who's here at AEI and at the University of Chicago, has pointed out that the poverty measures that are trying to take into account the value of benefits, like the supplemental measure, are increasingly not as accurate as they have been in the past with regard to reporting. And so I think we have to dedicate ourselves to making that Census Bureau and those Census Bureau studies link up to administrative data so that we can really see, and it's not anybody's fault that people who respond to Census Bureau surveys sometimes forget or aren't sure or don't report accurately. I don't know how I would necessarily respond to government surveyors calling me up and asking me personal questions, given all kinds of things I've learned over the years. But we need to work on that because we found in New York that people report to surveyors on the Census Bureau poverty measure less than what they actually get. And I think that is that true both urban and rural? Is it true in the South or North? I'd like to know more about that, and I really hope that over the next couple of years we work on that. And I think I hope we will. The second issue has to do with moving to opportunity. And moving to opportunity is a good thing. And I don't want us to convey in any way that we don't want to be open and even encouraging of people who are running into difficult times in a particular region due to an economic shortfall to say, I really do want to go to that place where there are jobs and where there are opportunities. Moving to opportunity has been enormously beneficial to New York City, for instance, and other large urban areas. I mean, you've introduced a new word to me, Jim, urbanicity. I love that word. I'm gonna start using that more and more. But you seem to be saying that urbanicity was a good thing for people that both moved, people that were in those cities where that took place, and for those regions more broadly. And I think that that's a kind of positive aspect of the story that we shouldn't forget as we try to address where there are unintended consequences or downsides related to the American Indian reservations, and others are where there's a lot of recent immigrants from South America or Mexico or in Hispanic populations, and then others are often very African American, and then others are white. And then so there were those distinctions by race and ethnicity, but there was a lot similar, and you mentioned education levels, and you mentioned other factors. But one you didn't mention, but is true, at least for some of those groups, and it is non-marital birth rates. And that really, cannot be overlooked, the extent to which children do better in households where they are raised by two active and involved parents, preferably married for the long haul. And I know, those rates are rising in some rural areas, and that's having, I think, some negative consequences. Now, my view on that is that we just need to talk about that. We need to be educational and directed about saying to people and young people about the importance of making a good decision about having children when they're ready with a co-parent to be successful at that. And it's not to say that single parents can't successfully raise children out of poverty, but that there are bigger challenges associated with that, which would lead to early learning interventions or better schools. Those also should be addressed, but we can't lose sight of this family issue. And I know there are people here at AEI that have pointed out that the part of the problem of the persistence poverty and growing poverty is that there have been some erosion of the family dynamic in rural areas where there hadn't been in the past, and I think we should talk about that. And then I guess I'll just come back to the place-based issue, because I come from a place that always tried to do things to make our place better and more attractive and more filled with opportunity and more generous with regard to assistance for working people. And and I know the economic concern about that, but I do think that the answer is in this. An answer may be in this urbanicity, in celebrating and paying attention to smaller cities in parts of the country that aren't getting the kind of attention that San Francisco or New York or the Boston are getting. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think there are lots of attractiveness to that. There's a lower cost of living, the labor supply is there. It could be enhanced with greater educational opportunities and employment opportunities. But these are wonderful parts of our country, and whether it's Little Rock or Lexington or Jackson, Mississippi, or places, I think that's a good place to start, as opposed to saying we're going to find a way to deliver services to that rural community that's way out there, where the transportation barrier really is serious. And that, to me, sounds kind of impractical, while focusing on regional cities that have potential to grow. And I would just point out, some of this urbanicity that's taken place in some cities has made those cities bust. I mean, you can't find an affordable place to live in San Francisco or in other cities. And we want to encourage the market to move toward these places where space and commute times can be more convenient and more easier and can add to the human capital of those communities. So those were my observations about the presentation. I do feel really grateful for you guys being here, and I'll stop now and ask if you guys have any comments on that or any things that you wish you had said that you didn't, and also any particular policy ideas you want to talk about. Dan or Jim?
Things that I haven't said. Let me say thank you for the invitation to come here. I thought it's great. Let me say a little bit about the family issue, because I've done a lot of work on that. And, I'm on the research advisory board of the National Campaign to Prevent Teen and Unintended Pregnancy. And, I had been pushing them for maybe 10, 15 years about doing something on rural America. And they, taking off on Sex in the City, they have a report now that's called Sex and the Non-City. And this particular report showed that in the case of rural adolescents, young women, teenagers, that they have a third higher rate of teen pregnancy and birth rates than in urban areas. And you think about starting off in life with a non-marital birth, and you know that it affects the prospect subsequently of marrying, of staying married. The disruption rates are very high, and also of marrying an economic attractive partner that can lift them out of poverty. So I don't see this as a panacea marriage, but I see it as one of many potential things that might be beneficial. So I think anything that supports the family, and it may well be that the best marriage support policy is one that promotes a good job and economic development in rural areas. So, but it is an issue that I think requires much greater attention than we've seen in the social sciences, and in the policy circles for that matter in terms of the discussion.
Jim?
Thank you for your comments both. A couple of reactions. One, to kind of on Dottie's point about SNAP. So SNAP is a national program, right? The benefits that are available are uniform across the lower 48. They're higher in Alaska and Hawaii. And it is a program that tends to be very responsive to the business cycle. And as you know, Dan actually had a chart on that. It turns out that the participation rate is actually higher in the non-metro rural America than it is in the metro area relative to other cash programs like TANF and stuff like that. Part of that, I think, is due to the historic kind of low benefit level of the TANF, the AFTC program, and so especially in the South has always been a relatively low amount, and the food stamp was kind of a larger benefit. Now, if people combine the two, then it kind of created more cross-state parity over time. If they combine both programs. So SNAP has actually been there to help out in these rural communities that in a way that isn't true with most other programs in the social safety net in the U.S. along with the EITC. Although the EITC is for people with work, but if work isn't there, then EITC isn't there either. And so SNAP actually turns out to be kind of the line of defense for many of these families in rural America. On the issue of survey quality and the link to administrative data, I'm fully supportive of that initiative and think that that's really crucial. I have a couple of projects where I'm linking either Social Security earnings records to the current population survey or the actual 1040 tax return. So I personally am engaged in active research, linking survey and admin. It turns out, at least on earnings, rural residents have both higher response rates and are better responders than urban residents. I don't know if that's true on the transfer programs. Okay. Now that the qualitative story is that in rural America they want to tell you their story, and so they tend to welcome the census surveyor in, and they tell a story, right? And including the kind of their economic situation. So whether or not that translates into the transfers, I don't know. I think that's a hugely important issue going forward. On place-based policy, one thing that I want to be clear, where economists tend to agree on is that it's unclear what the federal role should be on place policy. Okay. State and local governments, I think economists generally say, yeah, your local community ought to do that stuff. That's exactly right. Now, whether or not you should do a subsidy for a company to show up is another issue, right? Where economists tend to be a little bit more wary. But certainly investing in your local community on education, health, roads, all that kind of stuff, economists think that's absolutely correct. The issue is, should the federal government invest?
Right.
In a particular region, and why would they choose that region as opposed to another? So you have to come up with, you're trying to resolve some long-term inequity or to resolve some negative externality. So maybe it was kind of a nuclear waste site that has to be cleaned up in order for that community to move forward. So as long as you can come up with a justification for it, then I think you have a stronger case for making that. And I think the argument that was made back in the 60s for Appalachia is that this is an area that a lot of resources flowed out of, both timber in the early 20th century and then coal, right? And so, Appalachia was providing the energy to allow this country to grow. And as the timber started to move to other parts of the country, but then as mechanization started to take off to coal, I mean, coal employment peaked in the 1940s, right? So it's been a long decline, right, in the coal sector. And so as mechanization kind of took those jobs away, I think the argument was that, maybe there was an equity argument to reinvest in this region that kind of gave up some key resources to allow the rest of the country to grow at a faster rate.
I can't, given the topic of the day and issues, and Dan raised the issue of the politics that have changed. So I just have to ask one question, which you didn't address, and I want, since you're both here, and you I'm sure have some response to Ann Case and Angus Deaton's work on the deaths of despair and the opioid epidemic and other issues. Neither one of you really addressed that. Could you just give us a sense of what you think is going on there, and is it more severe in rural areas, or is that a cliche we've been sold?
It's real. Yeah, it's real, and it's primarily due to lack of economic opportunity. It's lost jobs, it's lost opportunity for these individuals. Because the depths of despair, it's primarily affecting men and women age 45 to roughly 60, right? And so we have increased rates of suicide, increased rates of death from alcoholism, drug addiction, things like that. This is a real phenomenon. It's a crisis in my state of Kentucky. It's actually, increasingly a crisis in the nation overall. It is there, and it's, it is affecting this population who have been displaced. Either they, had direct jobs in these resource extraction industries or jobs in closely related sectors, right? And so when those opportunities kind of went away, they felt kind of stuck in place. And maybe they were stuck because they had other obligations that kept them there, or there were other reasons that prevent them from kind of moving on, as it were. And so
and they may be of the age where moving is just much more hard, much more difficult.
Moving is much more difficult, and so so I think this is a real issue. I mean, partly because my presentation is already too long, but actually one of the chapters in my book is actually by Janet Curry, who's Ann Case and Angus Deaton's colleague at Princeton, and her chapter was on health differences between the central Appalachian region, the rest of Appalachia, and the rest of the United States. And one of the things on the family structure, so you do see a kind of a little bit of a convergence from 1990 on teen birth rates. Central Appalachia was the highest part, for the country, but there's still a gap. There's still higher. But the other thing that is a persistent problem is the rate of smoking by mothers is 3 times higher in Central Appalachia. It's like 35% of pregnant moms are smoking. And at Central Appalachia, it's about 10% nationally. And so Janet's point, who's done a lot of work on kind of toxic, fetal syndrome, and is that, there are some public health issues that need to be addressed also, because many of these children start off with a competitive disadvantage because of health disparities at birth.
Mm-hmm. Do you have anything on? Are you all right?
No, I agree. I agree with even the language of the geography of despair, or landscape of despair. I think the issue that also reinforces, Jim didn't mention race, but we're talking about rural white America, working class America. If you look at the rates of suicide and alcohol-related drug use and that sort of thing among African Americans or Hispanics, very, very low. So this is a white working class, rural white working class kind of phenomenon that is, I think, very clearly linked to economic problems.
Okay, now I never do this, which is do a session and not allow for questions from the audience, but I'm under some pressure to finish. So we're going to have one question.
Oh, it's too
and then we're going to, is that all right? Can I do that, Nicole? Yes, sir, way in the back. You got your hand up? So now we're looking for questions, and we also like to have,
I understand the rule of the game.
Okay,
It's
go
nice
ahead.
to meet you. My name's Todd Wiggins, and I'm very interested in solutions. So I'd like to ask one of you, if you were running for office, what would you do to solve some of the problems that we have? And by the way, I would suggest one way to cure alcoholism is only drink free alcohol. That's how I've been able to solve it.
I found that doesn't really work. Okay, so we're going to let the two experts give the one thing.
You know, I talked to people at HUD several years ago about incentivizing moves to opportunity and some sort of job network. I know there's some of that already going on. I think that would be one point to focus on. I also think one of the problems we have is just the way we fund schools in this country. You know, we can't agree as a society how to do this, and we have a lot of contentious politics around it. But I think another thing is just we've got to somehow bring rural schools up to speed, and you see it in terms of the quality of the physical structure. You see it in the quality of the teachers and their experience. You see it in whether they have a lab for biology. You see it in the offering of AP courses, all sorts of things, which I think has some effect on being marketable outside the region or outside the rural area. And what's happened, I think, is that rural areas have become collecting grounds for people who don't make it. So you look at, there's a book called Hollowing Out of America by Patrick Carr and Maria Kafelis in Iowa. And the book is about how these rural communities structure opportunities in their schools for those kids to leave. So the sort of best and brightest go to school, and the ones who stay behind are those who have sort of fallen through the cracks, the working class kids and so on in the community who don't leave. And so there's sort of a collecting ground for rural despair, chronic rural unemployment and so on. But I'm just talking about the supply side here a little bit, but go ahead, Jim.
Just one thing? So invest in children, and that would be through expanded early childhood education opportunities, investing in children by providing greater opportunities for child care for working parents, because we have a very weak system in this country for child care. And then, you know, it's too self-serving to say subsidize higher ed because we're both in higher ed.
Yes.
But, you know, but really
Subsidize higher ed.
But subsidize higher ed. You know, make it easier for these kids to figure out how to get on to school. So invest in children.
Could I just add one thing to that, just really quickly, and that is, you know, if you believe these Census Bureau reports, by 2043 or 44, the majority of people in the United States will be groups other than non-Hispanic white. We already have a majority of newborns are something other than a group other than non-Hispanic whites. The Census Bureau predicts by 2020 that the majority of all children. It seems to me right now we also have a big generational divide that's confounded by race, with an older white baby boom population that may or may not be supporting quote unquote other people's kids. And I think this is an issue that I think we need to talk about too, because what we do or don't do to support kids, going to Jim's point, will come up and bite us in about 10 to 15 years when people are replacing us in the labor market. Are they going to be there in 20 years?
There's a scholar named Scott Allard who's
Yeah.
done some important work on the different investments from the not-for-profit community into rural versus urban, and it's way disproportionate in that we do a lot in urban areas to alleviate poverty from the not-for-profit and side, but we do very little outside in the non-governmental entity in rural areas. And so I worry Scott may be watching, so I wanted to make sure I got that in. That's a good point. Thank you all very much.